The heavy swinging door to the kitchen hit the wall with a rhythmic metallic thud, sending a draft of cold air and the sharp scent of industrial bleach over table 24. My mother sat there, her fingers nervously smoothing a crease in the white tablecloth, her eyes fixed on the floor. My father, a man who had spent 40 years under the hoods of cars, sat stiffly in a suit that was 10 years out of style but pressed to perfection. They weren't in the ballroom. They were in the shadows of the service entrance. "We didn't want them embarrassing the important guests, Annabelle," my mother-in-law whispered, her voice slicing through the muffled music like a razor. She didn't even look at me. She was too busy adjusting her pearls. Behind us, the important people, senators, CEOs, and investors, laughed under $5,000 crystal chandeliers. I looked at Ethan, my husband of exactly 3 hours, expecting a spark of anger. Instead, he just shrugged. "It's just seating, Annabelle. Let it go." That was the moment I realized my marriage wasn't a union. It was a transaction, and I was about to set the whole ledger on fire. The illusion of the Grand Willow. The Grand Willow Ballroom in downtown Chicago was designed to make people feel small. With its soaring ceilings, gold leaf accents, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, it was a temple of old money aesthetics. Ethan's parents, Carol and Robert, had insisted on micromanaging every detail. They claimed they had experience with high society events. I had trusted them. I wanted to be the easygoing bride, the one who didn't cause friction. But as I stood there, watching a waiter nearly clip my father's shoulder with a heavy tray of sea bass, the easygoing version of me died. I scanned the room. The seating chart was a map of Carol's prejudices. The front tables, the gold zone, were packed with Ethan's father's business partners, a state senator, and the investors Ethan had been courting for months. My side of the family, my aunt, my cousins, and my lifelong friends were scattered like debris near the restrooms and the kitchen. My parents, the people who had mortgaged their small home to help pay for this wedding, were being treated like a logistical error. I found Carol at the marble-topped bar, sipping a gin and tonic. She was holding court with a woman in a crimson dress who looked like she'd had more Botox than birthdays. "Carol," I said, my voice low but vibrating. "Why are my parents sitting by the kitchen doors? There are empty seats at table 4. Carol didn't even turn around. "Annabelle, don't be tedious. Table 4 is for the venture capital group. Your parents are... Well, they're sweet, dear, but they aren't the type of people we need at the center of attention tonight. We have a reputation to maintain." The woman in the red dress smirked, taking a slow sip of her drink. "A reputation?" Yes. "My father worked 16-hour shifts at an auto shop so I could go to college. My mother managed a grocery store while taking night classes. They are my reputation." Carol finally looked at me, her eyes like chips of blue ice. "And they look like they've worked 16-hour shifts, don't they? Now go back to the head table. You're making a scene by just standing here." I looked across the room at Ethan. He was laughing at a joke told by a man in a 3-piece suit. He saw me, saw his mother, and simply turned his back. He chose his side. Fine. I would choose mine. The microphone and the shift. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I walked toward the DJ booth with a calm that should have terrified everyone in that room. Marcus, the DJ, looked up in surprise as I stepped onto the platform. "Microphone," I said. "Is it time for the toasts already?" he asked, glancing at his schedule. "Change of plans, Marcus. Give it to me." The music, some upbeat jazz standard, faded into a sharp silence. The room fell quiet in waves, starting from the back and moving toward the front. I could see Carol's head snap toward me, her face pale with sudden apprehension. "Thank you all for being here," I said, my voice echoing off the gold leaf walls. "We've heard a lot tonight about important guests, about reputations, and alliances. But before we eat, I want to introduce you to the 2 people who actually built the woman standing before you." I hopped down from the booth, the long train of my white gown snapping behind me like a whip. I walked past the senators. I walked past the CEOs. I walked all the way to the back, to the drafty, noisy table by the kitchen. "I want everyone to meet Daniel and Rosa Martinez," I said, placing my hands on my parents' shoulders. "My father doesn't have an investment portfolio. He has calloused hands and a heart of gold. My mother doesn't have a seat on a board. She has the wisdom of a woman who learned a second language at 40 just to help her daughter with her homework." The room was so quiet you could hear the sizzle of the steak in the kitchen. "I believe respect isn't something you buy," I continued, looking directly at Carol. "It's something you give. And tonight, the most important people in this room are sitting in the worst seats." I turned to a table in the center of the room. Table 6. It was occupied by 4 of Ethan's younger co-workers, guys who looked like they spent more on hair gel than I did on my car. "Brent," I said, recognizing one of the associates, "would you and your group mind moving to the kitchen table? I think my parents deserve a better view of their daughter's wedding." Brent, to his credit, looked horrified, not at me but at the situation. He stood up immediately. "Of course, Annabelle. Absolutely." The swap was a spectacle. My parents tried to protest, their faces red with embarrassment, but the guests were already standing, clapping. What started as a few polite pats turned into a roar. By the time my parents were seated at table 6, in the literal heart of the room, the important guests were leaning over to shake my father's hand. Ethan was fuming when I sat back down at the head table. "You humiliated my mother," he hissed. "She humiliated my family," I replied, not looking at him. "I just balanced the scales." The rest of dinner was a blur of tension. But Carol wasn't done. She had spent 30 years being the queen of her social circle, and she wasn't going to let a girl from the suburbs win. When it was her turn to give the mother of the groom speech, she walked to the stage with the grace of a shark. "Tonight is about building a legacy," she began, her voice smooth and professional. "When you marry into the Vance family, you aren't just getting a husband. You are marrying into a standard, reputation, influence." She took a long pause, her eyes finding mine. "We all come from different backgrounds," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Some of us come from generations of leadership. Others come from more humble beginnings. It can be a difficult adjustment to learn how to walk in these circles. To understand that in this world, who you know is just as important as what you do." The humble beginnings line hit the room like a lead weight. My mother's smile vanished. My father looked at his glass. "I trust Ethan to always make decisions that elevate our family," Carol concluded, stressing the word elevate. "To the Vance legacy." The applause was thin, brittle. I waited for Ethan to stand up. I waited for him to say, "Actually, Mom, Annabelle's family is my family now." He didn't. He just clapped and took a sip of his wine. That was the irreversible turning point. The marriage hadn't even lasted 4 hours, and I already knew I was done. But the night had one more surprise. Richard Hale, a man whose net worth could buy the ballroom 10 times over, stood up. He was the big fish Ethan's father had been desperate to land, the primary investor for their firm's expansion. Richard didn't go to the mic. He just stood at his table, a giant of a man with a booming voice. "I've spent my life in generations of leadership," Richard said, his eyes fixed on Carol. "And in my experience, people who brag about their standing are usually the ones with the least to offer. I prefer the humble types. They're the only ones who know how to work when things get hard." He turned to my father. "Daniel, was it? I heard you restore classic cars. I've got a '67 Mustang that's been sitting in my garage because I can't find a mechanic I trust with my life. You think you could take a look at it?" My dad blinked, stunned. "Yes, sir. I'd be honored." "Good," Richard said. He then looked at Ethan's father. "Robert, we'll talk about that deal on Monday. Or maybe we won't. I'm starting to think your standard doesn't align with mine." The color drained from Robert's face. Carol looked like she'd been slapped. By the time we got to the bridal suite, the air was thick with the scent of a dying relationship. Ethan slammed the door so hard a lamp rattled. "You happy now?" he yelled. You blew it. Richard Hale is pulling out. My father is losing the expansion because you couldn't just sit there and be a bride for 5 hours. I was a bride, I said, stepping out of my heels. I just wasn't a doormat. Your mother insulted my parents, Ethan. She called them an embarrassment. And you did nothing. Because it doesn't matter, he screamed. It's just words. But the money. The deal. That's our future. No, I said, my voice dangerously calm. That's your future. I don't want any part of a future where my parents are treated like trash so you can have a bigger office. His phone started buzzing. It was his father. I watched as Ethan's face went from angry to terrified. What? No. Dad, wait. Richard actually sent the email. Tonight. Ethan hung up and stared at me, his eyes wide. He pulled the funding. Not just paused it. He's out. And he's telling the other investors why. Good for him, I said. The next morning the world didn't just collapse. It imploded. Brent, the co-worker who had moved tables, had recorded Carol's speech. He hadn't meant to cause a scandal, but he was a humble beginnings kid himself. He had posted the clip to a private group, and from there it leaked. By 10 a.m., Humble Beginnings was trending in Chicago business circles. By 12 p.m., a local news blog had picked up the story of the wedding seating scandal. By 2 p.m., former employees of Robert's firm were coming forward with stories of how they were passed over for promotions because they didn't go to the right schools or come from the right families. Carol's carefully curated image was shattered. She was no longer the queen of the ballroom. She was the face of elitist arrogance. Her charity board asked her to take a leave of absence. Robert's partners began distancing themselves. Ethan came to me in the lobby of the hotel, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. You have to fix this, Annabelle. Post something. Tell them it was a joke. Tell them my mother loves your family. I won't lie for you, Ethan. If you don't, we're ruined. Everything we worked for. Everything you worked for, I corrected him. I worked for respect. And I found it. It's just not with you. I moved out that afternoon. It wasn't a long marriage, but it was an educational one. A week later, I went to my parents' house. The driveway was occupied by a stunning cherry-red 1967 Mustang. Richard Hale was sitting on a lawn chair in the garage, a grease-stained rag in his hand, laughing as my dad explained the intricacies of a carburetor. My mom came out with a tray of lemonade, smiling in a way I hadn't seen at the Grand Willow. How's the car coming along? I asked, kissing her cheek. Slowly, Richard said, standing up to shake my hand. Daniel is a perfectionist. He won't let me leave until every bolt is exactly right. He looked at me, his expression softening. I'm sorry about the wedding, Annabelle. But for what it's worth, you did the right thing. Most people spend their lives trying to fit into rooms where they aren't wanted. You realized the room wasn't worth the entry fee. My dad looked up from the engine, his face smudged with oil. You know, Annie, he said, I realized something that night. When you're at the back table, you can see the whole room for what it really is. You see who's real and who's just pretending. I smiled, looking at my parents, the embarrassing guests who were now the center of a much better world. Ethan and his family kept their reputation. But without the money, the deals, or the respect of their peers, it was just a hollow shell. They stayed in their gold zone, while I moved on to something far more valuable. I didn't ruin their world. I just moved a table, and the foundation they had built on pride and prejudice simply couldn't hold the weight of the truth.